Turn now to traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM for short, and I'm going to be using this section to look at a number of different concepts, including healing environments that we have kind of looked at throughout the course, and also an example of a traditional Chinese medical doctor, and a look at how it actually functions in real life. And so the photograph here is of somebody about to practice cupping. Some of you may have experienced this procedure, and so it's gotten a lot of press. I find that the media, I guess because it's based on sensation, it often just fixates on these elements that look dramatic, and they often show a picture of the doctor with this torch, whereas, you know, they could show them grinding up herbs, but I guess that's not as interesting to people. So it often misrepresents the tradition as a whole. So cupping is just one small part of traditional Chinese medicine, and it's been practiced for thousands of years, including in Egypt, in ancient Egypt. We talked about that healing system. And I also want to talk about the fact that traditional Chinese medicine has become so popular in Canada and other places in the diaspora. So it has often come into conflict with the government because the government is struggling to regulate the practice. Now, there's many reasons for this. The more cynical among us would say this is that, you know, pharmacies and so on are worried about their market share, but it is also that herbs are medicine, and so there's a sense that if you're going to regulate other forms of drugs, you have to regulate these. So I will be talking about that a little later on in the lecture. This is a quotation, a long quotation from Claudia Welsh, who is a traditional Chinese medical doctor, and you can see from her name she doesn't come from a Chinese background. And so increasingly people that are not from the Chinese diaspora are practicing traditional Chinese medicine. As the practice expands in the Western world, their training is being offered to people from any background. And as you can see from the title, this emphasis on hormones, a lot of the work really focuses on women, and I think this just points to the fact that it's often women that are going for these practices, and we can talk about why women are perhaps more open to these kind of practices. I also know from within my own family that one of the ways that TCM has really come into the mainstream is in its treatment of infertility. It's proven to be very successful in treating infertility, and so obviously hormones is very central to working with that. So Claudia Welsh writes, in the West, we ignore the fundamental causes of ill health and pay for it 3 times over. First, we suffer the immediate effects of living a stressful life and eating poor quality foods. Second, we suffer the long-term effects on our health. So this idea, a number of you mentioned on the discussion boards that we seem to have created an extremely stressful life for ourselves and our culture. Some of it's external, some of it's internal, and certainly I place myself within this is something that I have struggled with. Certainly if you have a demanding job, it's very easy to fall into states of stress, but I think it's important to note that from this point of view, we have to manage it. We have to make sure it's not impacting our health. Food, obviously, North Americans appear to be extremely addicted to fast food. I think this is less true in other parts of the world, but certainly in North America, it's very common for people to eat it regularly. And we know it's poor quality food. It's full of things like trans fats and sugar and salt. And so this is contributing to overall ill health. So from this point of view, you would immediately, these are 2 very obvious places to start with what the person can change. In Eastern medicine, the role of the doctor is to educate their patients about how to cooperate with nature. So you see that idea of that nature, you have to always be in alignment with nature because that's where the healing comes from within this natural system. And so you have to always work with staying in harmony with nature. What is TCM looking for in terms of health? And so we talk about alignment, we talk about harmony. These are key concepts within the Chinese tradition generally. And so we also find that idea of yin and yang that I introduced in the first lecture. And so many ailments are considered to be yin or yang. And so Xiao Lan Zhao writes that when she practiced in China, she saw a lot more yin ailments, and in North America, in Canada, she sees more yang elements, which are the masculine, which shouldn't be surprising to anybody. So these are ailments as a result of a fast-paced lifestyle, so it's associated with the masculine, with heat and so on. So Welsh writes, the life force is called Qi, in traditional Chinese medicine, and prana in Ayurveda, and is the manifestation of yang. Yin is manifest through the nourishing fluids that circulate in our bodies. So this idea that we're all made up fundamentally in our body and our energy system of yin and yang elements. If our yin and yang are balanced, our Qi is robust. So again, we find that idea of harmonizing these elements of yin and yang, that they're not opposed to one another, but they're complementary. It flows smoothly, and we have sufficient nourishing fluids to irrigate our tissues and deliver nutrients to them. So in her book, Welsh is very clear about being opposed to extreme approaches, like extreme forms of dieting, extreme forms of exercise. And in both her work and Shaolin Zhao's, they talk a lot about over-exercising, which is, I think, such an alien concept in our culture. People love to talk about how many hours they put in at the gym or their marathons and so on. But actually, for instance, when working with somebody who's trying to get pregnant, often the TCM doctor will say, stop it. That's too hard on the body, and you need to develop, to sort of nurture the body to make it healthy and able to become pregnant. So it flows smoothly, and we have sufficient nourishing fluids to irrigate our tissues. If yin and yang are out of balance, Qi and nourishing fluids cease to flow smoothly and disease arises. So this central concept within traditional Chinese medicine, that what we see in the symptoms of disease has a precursor in this disharmony that happens often years ahead. And so if we can catch it, these imbalances before, then the disease itself won't manifest. In the process of diagnosing, again, we see this hands-on approach. Typically, the TCM practitioner will take pulse, which looks very similar to the way it's done in the West, but there are a number of different pulses, and so they're looking for things like not just the heart, but also the kidney. And so this, again, is something that has to be taught. It takes a long time to learn these very subtle practices. And so one way it's sometimes broken down is into the 4 pillars of diagnosis: looking, listening, asking, pulse. And so I wanted to start with looking. So it starts with Shen, so looking at the state of the spirit first. And so we see this across these approaches to healing, that it's the spirit that's most important. If we remember what Maya Tawari talked about, that's the place to start from this point of view. So to observe the Shen, according to TCM, gives vital information about vitality, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, and this shows in the eyes, complexion, and state of mind. Then the practitioner looks at the body, so the body shape and constitution, and also if the body's emaciated, or if there are deficiencies, if there's hair loss, if there's overweight. And so this idea of just observing these aspects of the physical body. Appearance and demeanor, posture and movement of the body, eyes, face, mouth, limbs, fingers. So you can see this is very much taking in the whole person. And I actually have been told by a TCM doctor this includes smell. And some of you who work in healthcare will know that certain conditions create a certain smell. So the practitioner is also paying attention to that. Certainly the face is very important, the complexion, but also the hair. And so all of us know that you can often read somebody's health in the face if they're ill. So looking and then listening, right? So the idea of the sound of the voice, is the voice loud? Is it weak? Is it low? And what that indicates about the health of the person. Is there a cough? Is there trouble with breathing? So this idea of listening, but also listening to what they're saying to you and how they're saying it is an important part of this approach to healing. Then asking. So this would be common to all medical practitioners, taking a medical history, origin of the current problem. Now this is a bit different, living in environmental conditions, current and past emotional issues, including family issues. And so this idea of really paying attention to the person in front of you, that for each person it's different, and then followed by the pulse diagnosis. So as I said, there's a variety of pulses that are taken, and then the diagnosis is made based on that. As many of you will know, acupuncture is also a very important part of TCM once the person has gone through this process of being diagnosed. And so needles will be placed at certain points in the body on certain meridians related to where the condition is seen to be manifesting, or where there's some kind of blockage. And so this practice, it's been interesting to see, has been taken up by some Western medical doctors. I'm not quite sure how that works if you're not working within that larger energetic understanding. But so the idea is that the needle is inserted, and many of you will have experienced this. It's not usually particularly painful. It depends, but not usually. And I know a lot of people are very leery at first, but even when it's in the face, it's not painful. Although I was told by a medical practitioner that in North America they don't put the needles in as far because there's less tolerance for the feeling. It's not usually painful. It's almost like an electric current that sometimes can happen. And so the idea is that using acupuncture, you work with the flow of the qi in the body. And then once you've lain there for a while with the needles, they're taken out, and then sometimes you're given a massage as well. This is an image of a store that sells Chinese herbs. This would be ubiquitous in China, all across China. This system is still the central healing system of China. People use it all the time. There's hospitals based on it. And increasingly, it exists in countries like Canada. So if you go to a city like Toronto, if you go to the Chinatown, there's actually more than one Chinatown, but you can usually find one of these shops. And as I said, often the TCM doctor will send you to one where they'll give you a prescription, and then they weigh out the herbs for you. Now, as I was saying earlier, this came in for some controversy about 15-20 years ago, although I'll be talking about this in more detail. It seems to have subsided, and so the government is satisfied with the way it was resolved through the creation of basically a parallel system of colleges for TCM. This is an image of Xiaolin Zhao on the cover of her best-selling book, Reflections of the Moon on Water. Zhao has a medical clinic in Toronto, and she wrote this book, which proved to be very successful. And it talks about her journey. So she has a small biography in the book as well, and talks about the challenges of her childhood in communist China, and she was removed from her parents. It's a very sort of tragic story, but she was trained as a medical doctor in China, came to Canada to study medicine in Canada, and she recounts in the introduction how she came back to traditional Chinese medicine. Now, we've seen this a number of times with people like Jon Kabat-Zinn. When somebody's a medical doctor as well as practicing these other approaches, they have a certain amount of cultural capital in North America. So she talks about in 1986 in the emergency department in the biggest hospital in Kunming, China, that a 24-year-old woman named Jai Yu was rushed in. She was vomiting bright red blood, and from its color, I assumed it was coming from a hemorrhage in her upper digestive tract. So she talks about how they operated on her multiple times and they couldn't stop the hemorrhaging. And so in desperation, she remembered that she had an awareness of traditional Chinese medicine, and she writes on page 2, I had studied several traditional Chinese herbal formulas that were supposed to be effective in stopping hemorrhaging. One in particular, called the Yellow Earth formula, came to mind. I went to my office and looked up the formula in a reference book. I gave Jai Yu's family the list of ingredients and instructions. They would have to prepare the remedy at home and bring it into the hospital, since we had no facilities for cooking herbs. Within 4 hours, they returned with the herbal remedy. By now, Jiayu had lost so much blood she was unconscious and extremely weak. She was alive only because of the intravenous fluids and blood transfusions we had given her. We administered the herbs through a tube in her nose and waited. 2 hours passed and she did not vomit. 3 hours passed, then 6 hours, then 12 turned into 24. Something in the herbal formula had stopped the bleeding. For me, this experience was an incredibly powerful demonstration of the effectiveness of TCM. So this becomes a turning point, and she doesn't act on it immediately, but eventually Shaolin Zhao studies TCM and becomes a TCM practitioner. Zhao is very clear that this connects her to the spiritual traditions of China, and she writes, "I am descended from a great tradition of learning about the human body, mind, and soul that is thousands of years old and informed by the wisdom of Taoist philosophers." So she is putting herself within this lineage of Taoism, that religious tradition of China. They saw each body as a microcosm of the universe. When we live according to the laws of nature, we live in harmony and health. So this, in a nutshell, is TCM and her approach to health and healing. I've taken this quotation from the Shaolin Health Center website, where they're presenting the aims of the clinic. TCM provides a path to living a long life as free as possible from disease and sustained by emotional and spiritual well-being. So you can see right at the top, they're not talking about the body really as being at the center, but the idea that the body is an expression of the emotional and spiritual well-being. Its main therapeutic treatments are acupuncture, tuina massage, and herbal remedies, augmented by guidance on diet and fitness. TCM's overall goal is to promote wellness and prevent disease by striving for balance between yin and yang, the opposing forces governing all existence, as well as free, unhindered flow of qi, the vital energy of the universe. So this is a good synopsis for wanting to understand what TCM is and what its central practices are. An image of the waiting room at Shaolin Health Center in the Annex in Toronto. And I wanted to use this to connect us back to some of the concepts we've been talking about throughout the course, including the reading that you did on therapeutic hospital environments. So the idea of creating a therapeutic healing environment. And we saw this also with the Asclepion in ancient Greece, the idea that the aesthetics, the surrounding impacts our health. And increasingly, we know that nature impacts on people. Even just having a view of natural light in nature has a tremendous impact on people. And so even just looking at what you can see in this photograph, this is a very different waiting room compared to if I have that image of the reception at the hospital, which is that very sterile. There's no kind of personality to it. And so this is you can see there's a beautiful painting above the fireplace. There's a rug, there's natural light. It's very clean and clear, but it's got a lot of feeling to it. And in the corner is a statue of Kuan Yin, so the Buddhist Bodhisattva of compassion. And it really does make a difference how you feel going into the space. So if I'm dreading going into a space, which I often do in more clinical environments, they feel very artificial and unwelcoming. And so it seems to me that we should be paying attention to this and learning from this. That I'll just speak from my personal experience because I've gone to Shaolin Health Center many times. I actually look forward to going because the building is full of natural light. It's absolutely beautiful. The feeling is good, and I always pay a visit to Kuan Yin. And so even just the way that Kuan Yin is evoking care and compassion in that space, and you can see the orchid on the table, so flowers and so on. And so it's a very different, very welcoming environment. Here's a photograph of one of the treatment rooms at the center. You can see it's not that different from a doctor's office in that sense, but there's still that sense of light airiness and welcome, that kind of welcoming feeling. Very clean, obviously, but not sterile. And I think we really underestimate the fact is that most people are very nervous going into these settings, and so the idea that it helps calm the person, I think, is something that we often don't take into consideration. And we know that if the person feels comfortable, they're going to disclose more, they're going to be more open with their healthcare provider. As I mentioned earlier in this lecture, as TCM became more into the mainstream, the government was called on to look into regulating the practice in Ontario, and so there was some controversy with the government and so on, but how it was resolved was that TCM became self-governing, just like the doctors and nurses are in Ontario, and so they oversee the training and certification of TCM practitioners. And as far as I know, this has worked very well over the years. And so this is the same in BC. They've created a kind of what we would call a college. And so it's interesting to me the way this combines aspects of more traditional approaches to medicine with Western approaches and institutions. And so I think the Asclepius on the left-hand side is very symbolic of that, it's still traditional Chinese medicine, but it's within a different cultural setting. And so it's combining some of those structures with the more traditional aspects of Chinese medicine. TCM is probably, along with chiropractors, the most popular forms of alternative medicine, which I'll be looking at a little more, a little later in this course. And it's increasingly, in my lifetime, has gone from being seen as just bizarre quackery to something people will access all the time. And I'm hoping, if any of you have undergone TCM, that you'll share it with the rest of us on the discussion boards.